Hello, on Wednesday morning, I believe this is April the 6th. This will probably take a little longer than I normally want these videos to be as I make some comments on some of the information that I've run across in trying to understand what's going on in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and some of the history related to that, some of what's going on today, etc. One of the things that I want to uh, do again is emphasize that this is kind of a preface for future discussions. So I'm throwing some ideas out there, some of which are brand new, and many of which relate to ideas that have just recently been introduced to, even though they are issues that have been going on for decades. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say and seeing where you get information related to some of these topics. And I'll probably be doing a little more kind of reading and trying to follow a chain of thought, and not necessarily that these ideas are in any particular order, but to get all these ideas out there. So let me go ahead and jump in and see where we end up. And again, I look forward to your comments and what might be happening as we go down the road. So, one of the challenges in studying history is that we allow the same amount of time to study history today as we did 50 or 100 years ago. And later on, I'll be making some comments about the whole structure of education in America, the function of education, what it is we're trying to accomplish, how we're trying to accomplish it, and just the difference in the world today relative to 50 or 100 years ago, 150 years ago, with respect to how our education system perhaps has failed to keep up with what we could potentially accomplish going forward. So, as I recall myself, my own experience, 40 years ago or so, we did not cover much history, World or American, beyond World War II. What has happened since World War II is arguably deserving of its own focus. Of course, perhaps best taken as a senior in high school that looks at how the stage for the world today has been set based on events that have taken place post World War II. Uh, in addition, however, I would still think that we would want a thorough coverage of history leading up to and through World War II, although the definition, of course, of a thorough coverage of history could be, and in many ways is being, debated, and rightly so, but that history ought to be taught seems to be addressed in the variously phrased statement, those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. And there are different references. Santayana, philosopher, appears to have been the first to have made reference to a statement like that. Winston Churchill, perhaps most famously, has paraphrased Santayana's original statement. But the idea that, if we don't learn from the past, we're going to repeat the same mistakes. And then another individual an article I read, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, I apologize for that, but he made the suggestion that not only are we doomed to repeat history if we don't study history, we're actually, it appears, based on history and current events, doomed to repeat history even if we do study history. And that can be a whole different topic in and of itself. But what seems clear today is that on the international stage, we are being forced to reckon with more history, much of it immediate, but with roots dating back centuries, than most of us are prepared to address. As I've listened to and read various accounts of what is going on and why, some issues and questions have been raised, which I would like for us to consider more in future discussions, particularly with respect to the ongoing fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here's just a list of items that I'd like to talk about further going forward, and hopefully we'll have time to dig into each one of these, even though many of them, if not most of them, are interrelated. And I think one of the challenges that we face today is that uh, events don't take place in a vacuum. We often try to talk about events as if it's the only issue that needs to be considered, but it's a multifaceted world and multifaceted issues that frame the world of our experience, even when we're talking about experiences uh, of neighbors, all the different facets that each neighbor's uh, history consists of, will vary, or at least many. So anyway, before I try to chase too many rabbits, let me just go through this list again. I'm going to go through it. This will probably be a little longer than I intend for these videos to be, particularly given my rocky start this morning. But let me go ahead and go through this, because I need to go on to something else here shortly myself, and I'm sure you do too. So thank you for your time. First, probably unexpectedly on the part of Russia, there's been a greater unification of NATO and European countries in response to Russia's invasion than perhaps was expected. Now, it's not universal in Europe or around the world, the condemnation of Russia, but I think it is safe to say that the fractured or fracturing of NATO that seemed to have been taking place in recent years seems to have been reversed, at least here in the short term. One question we'll mention more directly later, is what is the purpose of NATO? Why does it still exist? I've seen a lot of comments suggesting that NATO was formed for the reason of keeping the Soviet Union in check, or responding to the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union was dismantled, NATO should have been dismantled. That perhaps is a fair point, but it's incomplete based on a short history of NATO on NATO's website, which suggests that there were three reasons for forming NATO. One of them being checking Soviet aggression or potential aggression against Europe. The second being to actually stamp out nationalistic tendencies, negative nationalistic tendencies, I perhaps should qualify that, in Europe by the influence of North American, with North America's influence, particularly American, and then also to strengthen, conversely, European identity as a whole. And so that, again, point of NATO and the perpetuation of NATO is a whole nother topic. But the fact that NATO and European nations, by and large, have united against Russia in this in support of Ukraine, I think perhaps comes as a surprise. At least many are suggesting that. But the flip side of that, and it speaks to a broader topic we'll mention, is the greater unification of nations seeking to destabilize America, and replace America's leadership in the world, namely Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries, but those being the key ones. India seems to be kind of in the balance at this point, from what little bit I've read about India's response to, and perhaps lack of vocal outright support of American efforts to provide support to Ukraine. But clearly there is, as we'll mention in a moment, a new structuring on the world stage taking place, a formalizing of a restructuring that I think has been several years in the making. The third thing is sanctions against Russia and Russia's leadership. One of the several items related to this. Yesterday, I heard an interview of a young man out of Moscow, I believe is where he was at. He's in Russia, and I believe it was Moscow, talking about the sanctions and what's going on in Russia. But some of the points, what impact has been felt by Russia's leadership, Putin and the oligarchs in particular, which perhaps raises a question, who are the oligarchs? How did the oligarchs come into existence as an entity, or as individuals that constitute this entity? What is their origin in the context in which they were created? And how did that, or does that, reflect the best interest of the Russian state at the time that they were created, post breakup of the Soviet Union, and today? And then how does, even more broadly, and I think a particularly important or relevant issue that I want to look at further, how does their origin and the context in which they're created reflect a degree of naivete and failure on the part of leaders in America, and perhaps trust in the American citizenry that our leaders were perpetuating or fostering the development of American ideals at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, with respect to uh, how the democracy and democratic ideals and free market capitalism and other ideals by which America is defined, whether or not those ideals are actually carried out, again, is a different discussion, or the degree to which they're carried out. But how did the oligarchy, the creation of the oligarchy, actually support, work against the best ideals of a functioning democratic state? To what degree was the formation of an oligarchy perhaps a necessity, even if it was counter to American ideals, or was it established? Was an oligarchy established with a view towards moving towards a better expression of American ideals? But that's a big topic that I wondered about a lot in the past, actually, and just a lot of commentary recently has brought that topic to my mind. And then next to is most affected by sanctions, the oligarchs, the war effort, the Russian people, as there's a lot of evidence that the Russian people themselves are the ones who are most directly impacted by the sanctions. And, even if we find all the yachts of the oligarch billionaires, what's the loss of a yacht to a billionaire? Are we really impacting Putin and Russian oligarchs with the sanctions, or are we creating other issues that we'll mention in just a second? And then finally, just broadly, and this is another topic, the history of sanctions themselves, who has affected their effectiveness in achieving the objectives for which they were implemented, and to mention later, why we are able to install sanctions and what is their purpose, what is their effect, intended and unintended. Fourth, the unification of the Russian people behind Putin, as they see sanctions as a second front in the defensive wars of Russia against the world. As I understand it, from what Putin is telling his people, this was a necessary incursion, and there's a list of items that Russia provided as far as justifications that, as I understand it, nobody in the West considers legitimate. But that's all that his people from state media are hearing is a reason for the war. And the degree to which the invasion of Ukraine didn't affect the Russian people directly, their troops were going into a neighboring nation. It certainly affected relationships that Ukrainians and Russians had, particularly in the border area, as families, friends, again, part of the deep history of that region that we, at least I myself, am not familiar enough with in leading up to this current context. But the degree to which Russia as a whole, the Russian people, were not directly affected by the invasion, how have the sanctions and their impact on the people and the daily lives of Russia and Russia's place in the world and ability to function as a nation in the world stage, how has that impacted the people in a way that has in fact rallied them behind Putin in the name of Russian nationalism, rather than helping them to foster a sense of dissatisfaction with Putin? It's been argued, I saw an argument recently, that when push comes to shove, it is nationalism, the priority of one's nation state over other bases of organization, such as religious, economic position, social class, etc., that takes precedence in international relations. That however, whatever the bases might be for all of us to organize around the world, and to whatever degree in the international scene we share different aspects of life in common, or more in common with people of other nations and people within our own nation, when you enter international frameworks, all the other bases, religious beliefs, social status, etc., take second place to the fact that it's our nation that is under attack or challenged or threatened, the identity of which, etc. The fifth thing, massive migrant crisis as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians flee the battlefront. So not only has a nation to address the massive migration that has been taking place around the world been lost, namely Ukraine, as a place of refuge. Ukrainians themselves, by the hundreds of thousands, are now seeking refuge around the world. The sixth thing, flooding Ukraine with state-of-the-art weapon systems, mostly small and mobile, when there is no guarantee who will be in control when the dust settles. Questions have been raised about some of the forces which have been central to Ukraine's resistance, especially the Azov Battalion, and the degree to which that is a Nazi-based or centered battalion, which speaks to one of the concerns that Russia claims with respect to justifying, or Putin claims with respect to justifying the invasion. But we're dumping, once again, massive amounts of modern armament, in this case, particularly small mobile armaments, in a region that may end up having little or no relationship with America, with the West, that may, in fact, simply be fostering a guerrilla warfare, which is the seventh thing, that could last for years. Large-scale destruction of many major metropolitan areas with a potential for a protracted guerrilla warfare situation in what had been a modern European nation. And agree, again, the degree to which this battle reflects Ukraine's position with respect to tending more towards an Eastern, specifically Russian framework, or a Western European framework is part of the tension behind the last 15, 20 years of history in Ukraine and Ukrainian-Russian relations and Ukrainian-Western, that is European and American relations. But we've seen in just a matter of weeks, massive, unbelievable destruction. I haven't watched a lot of the videos, but it may be a challenge to recognize sometimes that this isn't just a movie. This is decades of development destroyed in a matter of weeks, and it will take more than weeks to rebuild, whether ultimately the territory ends up under Russian, the West American, or Ukrainian independent hands. It's just been devastating on the nation with respect to its structure, material possessions, let alone with respect to the lives of the Ukrainian people. The eighth thing, renewed attention to the history of U.S. NATO actions and Russian reactions following the breakup of the Soviet Union. Again, why is NATO in existence? What is the function of NATO in a post-Soviet world? To what degree has the perpetuation and expansion of NATO actually led to this current conflict in a way that should have been clear to anybody who was paying attention? And I wasn't one of those people paying attention, but to what degree, as I see different reports on the history, to what degree has Russia, from the very beginning of the post-Soviet collapse, been telling the West, y'all need to not be expanding NATO or NATO American influence towards Russia? That would be considered aggression, and Russia will respond. Not just Putin, but other leaders even prior to Putin, Gorbachev, etc. So to what degree has the West, has America, in the choices that have been made in relating to Russia in a post-Soviet era, actually facilitated the development of the concerns, namely an aggressive Russia, that NATO was purportedly trying to prepare to address when there was nothing to address, at least initially, rather than pursuing opportunities for peace and a less volatile, less militaristic establishment of order in the region. So the ninth thing, violations of promises made by the U.S. and NATO to Russia. vis-a-vis what I was just talking about, and by Russia to Ukraine, particularly with respect to Russia and Ukraine, particularly how Ukraine handled her nuclear weapons in the post-Soviet era. But again, in the years since the Soviet Union fell apart, what promises were made implicitly and explicitly to Russia and to the post-Soviet world that had been the Soviet Union, and how have we been faithful to or reneged on those promises in such a way that we've set the stage for this event to happen. 10th, and one of the big things that I think has been crystallized, and I think it's been in development for years, and I think, again, one of the points of this video, which I will be wrapping up hopefully soon, and I'll be able to go back and put in chapters, so if there's a particular topic you want to look at, then you can do that. But the establishment of a new world order into two perpetually antagonistic and overlapping spheres. First, an alliance of anti-democratic states, which by policy and action work against the best interest and ideals of democratic societies. And this harkens back to the point I made earlier. Russia and China, which now appear to have been engaged in even more formal declaration of unity or alliance than was recognized prior to the invasion, but then also expanding to Iran, to Venezuela, to other nations who have grievances, perhaps in fact legitimate, against the U.S. and how the U.S. has in effect managed the world scene post-World War II. And against that group, the alliance of democratically founded states, which it now appears to be more publicly evident and a part of this whole discussion I'm hoping to initiate this morning, have talked about democratic ideals and the spread of democracy around the world, but which have acted in ways which ultimately reflect a self-centered focus on how democracy around the world should be defined when democracy is purportedly established, or some other form of governments, if in fact that would be deemed more favorable to American interest rather than to the interest of the development of a truly free democratic state based on liberal principles, which include the free exchange of ideas. In other words, to what degree has America, in her role as sole superpower post-World War II, used that role to truly foster the development of democratic ideals in nations, rather than using her role to foster democratic ideals, the degree to which nations that sought to pursue those ideals pursued them in a way favorable to American interests, or that when nations went in directions that didn't appear to be favorable to American interests, sought to foster a different kind of governance that would bend towards supporting American interest rather than the ideals for which America purports to stand, on which she was founded. And that gets into a whole different discussion I hope we have before too long about American idealism. What are the ideals? How well or how poorly have we adhered to those ideals? How well or how poorly are we continuing to try to achieve those ideals, et cetera, et cetera. And then just a couple more points and I'll wrap this up. A drawdown of emergency reserves, such as the strategic petroleum reserves. I forget the exact acronym that's used in the title. But reserves that are being drawn now, it would appear, to address a political crisis rather than a strategic crisis for which they were instituted. So that when an actual strategic crisis develops, if in fact World War III breaks out, if this new world order, which I made reference to a second ago, crystallizes and there is a conflict on the order of a new world order, World War III type conflict, will we have created a crisis by drawing down on strategic reserves today, when for what I think are more political reasons than an actual crisis situation, a la World War II and America's response in World War II, where those reserves would be needed when the total global order is in fact absolutely disrupted. The 12th thing I think I'm on, a continued threat to democratic ideals in the West, particularly freedom of speech, begun under the pandemic and in response to educational policies deemed wrong and subject to banishment, which are two topics that we can deal with later, and the second in particular, I'll be wanting to deal with more. As information ideas deemed inappropriate or antithetical to the official narrative regarding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and America's role in that conflict and leading up to it are removed from the public sphere. I think I mentioned yesterday, didn't know about Russia Today television station or YouTube station or whatever it was until just recently. As I understand it, it has, or at least major components of it have been withdrawn, just erased from the system, from YouTube archives, etc. And how is that reflective of freedom of speech and ideals on which America is founded? In other words, again, I think I mentioned, and if I didn't, I'll mention it again. And if I did, it's worth mentioning again. To what degree are ideals such as freedom of press, freedom of expression, et cetera, central to our understanding of how life ought to be lived, so that when we deny those ideals with respect to ideas that we disagree with, we're actually denying what we said were foundational principles, foundational ideals. And I would suggest that any system which abandons itself to save itself, for example, President Bush's claim back in 2008, when he said we have to abandon the free market to save the free market. That's a loose paraphrase of what he said. But we've got to abandon the free market to save the free market. Well, if your principles or your system by which you live do not carry you through the difficult times, and the question is whether that system, those principles were really a principled system by which you ought to try to live anyway. If you abandon your principles, then have the principles already been lost? Has the value of those principles already been lost, or the value of the system already been lost? Even if you manage to somehow save it or save some caricature of those principles by which you said you were living. And then a couple more things. 13, an about face in U.S. foreign policy as it seeks to replace Russian oil on the world stage with related confusion around the world. And this here, I'm talking about, our failed appeal to Saudi Arabia, again, to pump more oil. Appealing to Venezuela and Iran, which, as I understand it, was a deal that is or was being brokered by Russia to get them to put more oil on, or to change the sanctions related to those countries so that they would put more oil on the stage, at least short term, to replace Russia's oil, which again, to me, seems more like a political than certainly a consistent, rational approach to dealing with situations in the world. And I'm not even yet talking about, which I will mention in a minute, whether or not the whole approach of sanctions is a good idea. And that's the next thing. Well, related to the next thing, but lost trust in the U.S. as a stable economic force on the world stage, number 14. If we wanted the dollar to be the currency that the world uses, if we wanted to have a financial system which is centered on America and the dollar and all the benefits that flow from that, and I've seen different over the last several months, different comments on what that means. I'm not an economist, but different comments on the value of that and what would be lost if the Chinese yuan or some other source of international trade were to take the place of the dollar, the negative impact that would have. if we're using that to try to control nations, which we obviously have, and sanctions are geared towards that, then how can the world have any faith in the system? Why wouldn't they be looking for a different way of structuring their economy, a different answer, which China is now offering to provide? Um, and what does trust in the U.S. mean if, and none of this, I should have said at the very beginning, I meant to, none of this is defense of what Putin has done. Uh, the invasion is wrong on its face, but the reasons for the invasion and how we respond to the invasion bear examination. And then the last thing I'll mention is the lost focus on the rest of the world. How many of us were aware that Afghan girls are not being allowed to school like the Taliban had promised? Questioning about our exit from Taliban or from Afghanistan and the Taliban takeover. What does the world think we can do in leading anything anyway if we come to Ukraine's aid? And then, what about ongoing conflicts in parts of Africa, which arguably don't receive as much attention as they ought to anyway? Certainly not enough attention, discourse, discussion in the U.S. with respect to how we ought to or ought not to intercede in those conflicts. And then the last thing I'll mention, I think I already said that, but this will be the last thing I mention as it just crossed my mind. How are we, meaning America, justified in using these other nations to fight proxy wars against Russia or the Soviet Union or communism or whatever, the ultimate enemy is, in an effort to avoid having to engage directly in conflict ourselves, let alone have conflict touch America's shores. I don't want World War III and a nuclear battle any more than anybody else. Nuclear battle is the last thing I want. And I agree that the absence of war, absence of conflict is not necessarily peace. But the degree to which we are facilitating conflicts, for example, in Ukraine, in an effort to achieve goals other than, or perhaps greater than, but I'm not even sure that counts anymore, the survival of Ukraine as a nation on its own, is that something for which America ought to be held accountable? Particularly if America hasn't and continues to fail to take advantage of opportunities to engage in a peaceful resolution that allows for the truly free exchange of ideas between people from all perspectives. Well, again, much longer than I intend for these to be, and I may go back and redo this, certainly edit it, try to cut it down a little bit. But as I've watched and listened to various commentaries and the ebb and flow of the last few weeks with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, just some different topics that I've tried to jot down yesterday and share with you today to get your feedback on what in the world literally is happening and how should we respond? How have we, meaning America, set the stage for these things to happen? And what can we do going forward to do a better job in establishing peace in the world, prosperity for all, and all the ideals that we perhaps have given up on? And I think I'm more aware now than ever before that we may not have faithfully been pursuing over the last several decades. Again, thank you all very much. Look forward to getting your comments and your thoughts and other sources of information that you might be able to provide to me so that I can better think and we together can better think about these topics. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.